Okay, great. Well, for any of you that I think I recognize most people's names on the call. My name's Wesley Tucker. I'm an ag business specialist with the University of Missouri Extension, and succession planning. I listed there succession planning coordinator is kind of something that I've tried making my specialty the last few years. I've been with Extension about 20 years, and I started out early in my career doing a lot of estate planning classes. But then we're going to get to some slides a little bit later that we're going to talk about the difference between succession planning and estate planning. And they're two very, very different things. They're both important, but they're very, very different. My father and I farmed together with my wife and my mother, and it's coming on 7 years ago, when my father passed away. I saw a lot of the just downright incorrect advice and things that my mother went through. So that's when I really, if I wasn't passionate about this topic before then, that's when I really, really got passionate about it. So we always have to put this disclaimer in. We are not attorneys. Ag business specialists, sometimes we border that line of people will say we're giving legal advice. We try not to cross over into the attorney's lane, but we try to tell you kind of the way we see things and try to give you education the best we can, but we can't answer specific questions that can only be answered by an attorney. So we all know this scenario right here is shaping up. I mean, by 2029, 20% of the population is going to be over the age of 65. And the baby boomers were, one of the most entrepreneurial generations that started lots and lots of small businesses in rural America, as well as farms. And they're nearing the age of retirement. So in the next 10 years, we are going to have a massive, massive rollover of farms and small businesses in small towns that are going to be transferring from the older generation to the next generation. Research would tell us that if we pass a farm or a small business, if we sell that to someone that is not related to us, then that business has about a 70% chance of being successful. If we give that same business, instead of selling it to a non-interested party, if we give that to a family member, it only has about a 30% chance of being successful. And we're going to come back to this and talk about this here in just a few minutes. But that's why this is so, so important. So, my goals for this whole idea of succession planning is, yes, to help you figure out how to successfully transition the business from one generation to the next, but also not just to pass it to the next generation, but to pass it in a way that it becomes a thriving business for that next generation. So the ones taking over have the skill set to make this business successful, and it can go on and be a thriving business. But the goal that a lot of people miss is this third one. This is the one I am so passionate about, is let's do it in a way that maintains those family relationships and keeps families communicating with one another. Ron Hansen from University of Nebraska, I've heard him do a lot of talks on succession planning. And one of the things he constantly points out is he says, not every family has a family Christmas after the farm moves from one generation to the next. And you just think about that. How many families end up getting tore down the middle fighting over the family farm after it moves to the next generation? And so what we want to do is we want to avoid that. And it becomes very, very important how we do this process to do that. I wish there was an easy button for this. I really wish there was an easy button, but this is hard. And this is hard for multiple reasons. These are just a few of them. But one of them is, small businesses and farms generally are low profitability enterprises. Every dime that we make, we generally roll back into the farm or the business. And because of that, most of our equity is tied up in long-term assets. So it becomes very, very difficult to even compensate another generation trying to come into the business. Can we even afford more than one generation in the business at one time? Also, have we done much retirement planning? How many farmers establish IRAs and 401ks and things like that? Generally, they don't, because just what I said, every dime gets rolled back into the business. But I didn't realize in the beginning until I spent time coaching more and more families, and it's this idea of self-worth. The reality is, and unless someone is added later, every name I see here on the call today is female. you generally, as the female in the operation, don't struggle with this as much as your husbands do. But your husbands generally later in life often are going to struggle with that their self-worth is that they are a farmer or they are a small business owner or whatever it is. And I find that for people north of the river, their self-worth and identity is in how many acres I crop. And south of the Missouri River, it's how many cows I run. And to take that away from them suddenly makes them feel like they no longer have any self-worth. And that becomes really, really difficult. A lot of times mama is ready to buy the RV and to do some traveling and turn the cows or the planter over to the next generation. But dad just has a really, really hard time letting go of that. And it creates an identity crisis for him. That makes this process really, really difficult. So I already kind of walked you through these numbers real quick. So if I transfer it, sell it to someone, 70% of the time, generally it's successful. If I give it to my kids after I die, it's only 30% of the time successful. Third generation success rates are even lower. Why is that? And this is where I want you to try to give me some comments here. Why is the exact same business less successful if I pass it to my kids versus if I sell it to someone else? Why?
From my family,
everyone speak at once.
A leader within the group that wanted to take control and be responsible for the rest of everyone else. So we had a farm that was passed down in our family. It was 1,000 acres in Texas, mainly corn, cotton, sorghum, wheat, those kinds of things. And once my grandmother passed, and the farm was passed down to my mother and her sisters, and nobody wanted to take control. Nobody wanted to be the leader, and everybody was afraid of hurting each other's feelings. And so basically it came down to them ending up splitting the farm between the 13 of them. And now 6 of them run an LLC together while the rest of them have just built houses. And so the profitability has gone down because of the lack of participation. But also it's gone down because, like I said, everybody's afraid to hurt each other's feelings because, this is mommy and daddy's farm and, the sentimental attachment to it.
Wow, good example. Someone else. No one's going to give me the example I was expecting. Generally, if I'm doing this in a group, the example everyone says, well, that younger generation, they just don't want to work hard. They just don't want to work. And, they don't have any skin in the game. There is some portion of that. There's no doubt about it. If someone is going to get a loan to buy a farm or a business, they have to run the numbers. They have to go through some of that. And there is some portion of that. But I'm going to tell you this next slide right here. I can't take credit for it. I got this from John Baker, the director of the Beginning Farmer Center at Iowa State. I saw him give this slide down in Memphis, Tennessee, I believe it was, at a Women in Ag Educators Conference. And this slide here changed my career more than anything. The issue is, I don't think it's the younger generation's fault often that this doesn't work. I think it's the older generation's fault for why it doesn't work. And here's why. John showed this slide. He said, if you're, as a small business or a farmer, if your goal is just seeing the continuation of the family ownership of the land, then that is very easy. All you have to do is have an estate plan. You can go to any lawyer and draw up a simple trust. You can go online and print off a beneficiary deed and probably do this. All you got to do is pass your land to your kids. But if your goal is just like Ann just described, if your goal is not just seeing the land change hands, but actually seeing my business continue beyond me, see, the business is more than just the buildings or the land. It's an actual business. Then you need a succession plan. And a succession plan is very different than an estate plan. It's not just about passing the stuff to your heirs. It's about figuring out how we're going to manage this money and assets and all of this stuff that we want to see them take over. But while also, we need some money to be able to retire ourselves and be able to support ourselves in the latter years of our life. And you know what? We don't need an heir, like Ann just said. Well, there was 13 heirs. You need a business successor that's going to step up and take charge for the business and see that it continues. And then this line going back over here is, guess what? If you have more than one child, you also need an estate plan. So you need both. You need a succession plan and you need an estate plan. And I'm going to talk a lot about how they mesh together. Now, I'm going to tell you right now, if you want this to be a very, very simple process, make sure you only have one child. Once you get past one, just don't have any more. You have to eat all the rest of them or something, but you can't have more than one child if you don't want this to get a little bit messy and a little bit complicated. And so that's why this whole process becomes important. So I always say, that is why it's so important for the older generation to prepare the next generation to take over and to set the plan in place. Because every family I have coached, if the older generation put a plan in place prior to and had it all lined out and trained the next generation, this could be seamless. But generally what happens is the older generation doesn't want to deal with it. They just continue to hold on to it because of that self-worth and all of that stuff. They hold on to it tightly until the day after they're gone, the checkbook gets passed to somebody. And then that's when the claws come out and this becomes a really nasty mess. Now, I don't have time, again, as I said, to go into a lot of detail on a lot of stuff, but I want to just introduce you just briefly to this idea that when you do a balance sheet, you have short-term assets, you have intermediate assets, and you have long-term assets. And the reality is, in this whole estate and succession planning process, we are going to treat each of those differently, because we can't expect to just one day step out of the business and ask the next generation to buy the land, the cows, the machinery, and the crops and all of this stuff one day. It's not going to happen. So we're going to have to treat each of these differently. Some of them we're going to allow the next generation possibly to earn through the years. Some of them we're going to allow them to lease. Some of them we may allow them to buy. But we're going to treat each of these very, very differently, okay? And just a real quick example of where this becomes important. So for instance, I'm working with one farmer, very, very large registered cattle producer, has lots and lots of registered cows, lots and lots of land, has multiple kids, and none of the kids wants to come back and take over the farm. But you know what that landowner said was, he said, I've got 2 employees that helped me get here, and I would like to reward them. So how can I still treat my kids equitably, but also reward these employees? And so one of the things we've talked about is, well, okay, leave the land to the kids, but for every year that those employees stay in the business, maybe they earns 2.5% of the cow herd, so that over time, if they each stay with you, for another 10 years, then each of them will have 25% of the cow herd. Now they've got half of the cow herd. So if something happens to you, they can now go get the loan, buy out the remainder of the cows from the heirs. And oh, guess what? Let's put a long-term lease in place that says the kids have to lease the land back to these 2 employees that are going to take over the operating entity for you. Just things like that to think about, how am I going to treat my short-term assets, my intermediate, and my long-term differently in this process. Sweat equity is something that is probably the most difficult thing to consider in this. And I'll give you a quick example. So in 1990, Dad gets hurt in a farming accident, and he asks Roger to come home and help run the farm. Roger has 1 brother and 1 sister who are not involved with the farm. In 1990, the farm's worth $300,000. Roger quits his good job in town, comes home, helps run the farm, and takes over. 25 years later, Mom and Dad are gone. Now the farm's worth $1.2 million. How should the farm be split? How are we going to split it? Well, if we were in a group, I'd get a bunch of discussion going here, but I'm afraid to open this one up a little bit because we can get down some rabbit holes. But the reality is, the mom and dad have to decide how they're going to do this. Some people will say, well, I'll just split the 1.2 million equally among my 3 kids. Well, is Roger being treated fairly in that or not? Well, does it make a difference if Roger was given a house to live in and bought a new farm truck every 2 years and maybe even used mom and dad's equipment to operate 1,000 acres of his own ground that he leased on his own? The reality is, I've seen every scenario under the book. And that's why this slide right here, compensation should equal contribution, becomes very, very important. I have seen situations just like this, where, Roger quit a job making $50,000 a year in town, comes home, and mom and dad say, hey, Roger, there's not enough profit in the business this year. We can only give you $20,000 a year. But, we'll make it up to you someday. What does that mean? Well, I'll tell you, if it's not put in writing, it doesn't mean anything, because what happens a lot of time is, come the end of the day when mom and dad are gone, Roger still only gets a third of the farm, just the way it would have any other. So he give up compensation during life, and he's not compensated additionally after death. Alternatively, I've seen this last case scenario where I'll call him Bubba, or not to be said, it may not be Bubba, it may be little Sally, and her new husband takes mom and dad's equipment and basically uses and abuses mom and dad for 25 years and leases part of the farm from them for $25 an acre when it should have been bringing $200 an acre. I've seen every scenario under the book as I've coached families. So the reality is, it has to go back to, am I compensating my next generation that's part of my operation? Am I adequately compensating them for what they're bringing to the business? If not, I need to seriously consider that in my estate plan. And I mentioned John Baker earlier. This was when he was doing research for one of his books that he wrote. He was over in Europe, touring several countries over there, working with some people on succession planning over there, because what, we find out that this isn't just an American thing. This isn't an East or West thing. This is something that happens everywhere. And he happened to be on a dairy farm where the owner of the dairy farm was one of three boys. He was one of three boys that his father had had. And he'd come back and taken over the dairy and bought out the farm from his two brothers. Well, ironically, that dairy farmer also had three sons of his own. And kind of like him, only one of his three sons were involved with the operation. It's just coincidental how that worked out, one of three and one of three. But anyway, someone in the interview process asked the dairy farmer, they said, what are you going to do in your estate plan when you die? I see you got one son here that's a part of the dairy with you. And he said, well, I'll do the same thing my dad did. I'll leave the farm to my three boys. And someone turned to the son that was part of the operation, and they said, how do you feel about that? And he said, honestly, he said, I've spent my entire life helping my dad pay off my uncles. Now I'm going to spend the rest of my life, once I take over, paying off my brothers. And so the question does become, how often should a farm have to be purchased? Because what tends to happen is, we go through life, borrowing money early on, just about getting the farm paid for if we're lucky, and then we pass away and we leave it to our kids. And if only one of the 3 or 4 kids is going to take over, what do they have to do? They have to go in debt and buy it out from their brothers or sisters. And they go way in debt and their equity drops. Then they spend their life paying off their brothers or sisters and hopefully get the farm about paid off whenever they die. And then guess what? They die and leave it to their kids, and one of them takes over and has to go back in debt. So if you remember, I said the simplest way to do this is make sure you only have one child. But the question does come up, and each of you are going to have to answer this differently, but does a farm have to repurchase itself every 30 to 40 years every time the generation transfers? Yes or no? Everyone's heard about the golden rule, what the golden rule is, do unto others as you'd have done unto you. Does anyone know what the estate planning golden rule? The estate planning golden rule is not do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. It's he who has the gold makes the rules. That's the reality in estate planning. And the reality is, you decide what happens to your stuff. And the first thing I will tell you is, there is no law or statute that says at the end of the day, everyone's columns have to add up to the exact same penny. There is nothing that says that. You decide what you want to have happen to your stuff. But the two most important words on that slide are you decide. Because what generally happens is, well, I'll leave it to my kids and I'll let them figure it out after I'm gone. That doesn't work very well. And we could all, if we had time, tell stories. That just doesn't work very well. The most important part here is for us to make the hard decisions and decide how we want this process to proceed. And again, back to what I said earlier, compensation should equal contribution. I should be compensating someone for what they're bringing to my enterprise, and I should be making sure that I treat all of my kids fairly. Fairly does not necessarily mean equally for everyone. It may for you, but it may not for others, okay? Now, I will tell you, there are tools in our toolbox to think about how do we treat business and non-business heirs equitably without trying to put the one out of business. And so we're going to talk a little bit about those. I don't have time to go into each one of them in depth, but these are some of the things we have in our toolbox. Life insurance. Life insurance can be the great equalizer. You know, if I've got 3 kids and I know only one of them wants to come back and run the farm, then maybe I buy life insurance on myself so that the other ones can get, cash when I die and the one can get the land. Maybe this all depends on if mom and dad are healthy enough to be insurable and looked at early enough in life. Maybe if I am the son or daughter that wants to take over the business, maybe I buy life insurance on my parents. Now that can sound pretty morbid, I know, but if I know that the day after the funeral, I have to come up with $2.5 million of cash to buy out, my brothers or sisters, what better way to try getting at least a start on it is taking out a life insurance policy. Now, I want to make sure I tell my parents why I'm doing that. But, life insurance can be the great equalizers. Buy-sell agreements, first option to buy or first option of refusal, all of these kind of things I lump together. But, I've had family meetings and I've talked to my kids and I know that only one of my kids wants to come back and take over the farm and the other ones really don't. They really want the cash. Well, then what better way than instead of letting them fight over those terms for me to go ahead and put in place how that process should work. And it goes back to remember my goals for succession planning. That goal number 2, I don't just want to transfer the business to the next generation. I want to transfer it in a way that the next generation has the best chance of surviving and being successful, but also to maintain those family relationships. So when I walk out my front door, I look across the road at a farm that was a century farm. There was 5 kids, okay? So dad had passed away, mom had 5 kids. So she did the right thing. She went to a lawyer and she had a trust drawn up to make sure and pass her farm to her 5 kids. But the problem is she stopped at the estate plan. She didn't think about the succession plan and taking it one step further to make sure and put in place how one would sell out if they wanted to cash their portion out. And the reality was there was 5 kids, 150 acres, all right? And 2 of them wanted to keep the farm. 3 of them were from out of state. They no longer lived here in Missouri, so they did not want to take over the farm. You know what they wanted? They wanted to go ahead and sell out their portion. Well, what happens when you have 5 kids that are distraught over their mother's death? They're not in good negotiating phase at that point anyway, but someone wants their money immediately. It can get ugly. And so basically they could not come to an agreement. Well, no problem. The 2 that want to keep their 30 acres each, they can keep their 60 acres, right? And then the other ones can sell off that. That's not the way it worked. All right. They ended up selling the whole farm to someone completely different. And I dare say that dad probably was rolling over in his grave that his farm now has left his family and will have no one of his name farming that land. That's not what he would have wanted to see happen. But all they would have had to done when they drew up that trust is go one step further and say, guess what? If someone wants to sell out, this is the process by which it happens. You can even stipulate the price. You can stipulate by appraisal or by 75% of the appraisal value. Again, you have the gold. You can decide how you want to do this. But if mama and daddy will make those hard decisions and put those in place, it will go a whole lot further to giving the one that is coming back to take over a chance to be successful, but also it'll go a ton further to maintaining those family relationships, a whole ton. Maybe you want to think about creating some type of legal entity structure where you say, okay, we're going to create an LLC or something like this where everyone's going to have a share ownership in this, but we're going to give Johnny because he's the one that's here. We're going to give him the controlling share. So Johnny's going to operate the business on behalf of the other ones. Or maybe we say, we're going to leave the land to all of them equally. They each get their portion, but guess what? Johnny has a long-term lease for the next 10 to 15 years to lease it from his brothers and sisters for 75% of the county rental rate. Again, the sky is the limit of the tools that are in the toolbox that you can use to make this process as seamless as possible. But you got to put that plan in place. And you can't just stop at the estate plan. You can't just go get a trust and say, I'm all done, unless you put clauses in that trust to deal with this idea of what if someone wants out, how do they farm together, and had a perfect example there. You know, no one really knew how to take over and how to hurt anyone else's feelings. So it split up. Now the business is really kind of not really there anymore. Well, we could have put a plan in place to have done this, okay? And the other thing I want to encourage you to think about, I mentioned earlier the idea of those different levels of assets, short-term, intermediate, and long-term. Sometimes we have to think about, do we separate the real estate from the operating entity that's actually farming the land? And this makes a big difference if it's a big enough farm that it actually is generating profits and it's not a hobby farm. It's actually creating a business that's viable. Then we could do this several different ways. We can say, okay, well, I'm going to separate off the operating entity, and maybe I give everyone a shared ownership in the operating entity. But like I said, Johnny has the right to control the entity for the benefit of the others. Or maybe I just creating the operating entity with Johnny alone, but I leave the real estate to everybody. Maybe Johnny has a long-term lease on the real estate. Johnny doesn't necessarily have to own all of the land. He just needs the ability to use the land. He doesn't have to own the dirt that he's driving on. He just needs the right to be able to drive on the dirt. So, ways to get creative and think about that. Back in January, I had the chance to be at the Legacy Project Summit in Chicago, and Dick Whitman showed this slide, and I stole it from him, so I gave him credit down there. He said it this way, and I love this picture. He said, some of your kids may be on the ownership train. Some of your kids may be on the management and labor train, but they don't all have to be on both trains. But the important thing is for me as the older generation to create the linkages of how those two tracks are going to join up. That's back to where that slide that I said, the reasons a lot of our farms are not successful beyond when we're gone is not necessarily a function of, well, those lazy kids just didn't want to work. Maybe it's I didn't do the right thing of creating those linkages between those two trains to make sure and give them the best chance of still calling each other brother and sister and not hating each other afterwards. So that becomes really, really important. Another slide from that Top Producer Summit, this goes all the way back to 2005. I love this one. This was Henry Landis showed this. He said, we have a family circle where everyone in that family, is characterized by caring and support, and they are rewarded by love and gifts. We have some people, we have this business job circle where we expect people to have competencies and performance tied to their objectives. As a result, they are rewarded with salaries and wages and benefits. And then we also have this other circle that's about equity, about owning the stuff. Again, owning the land that someone else might be driving on. And they are rewarded by dividends and return on their equity. We have three different circles, and you know what? Not every one of our kids has to be in all three of those circles. That's where we get in trouble, where we try making everybody fit in all of the three circles. Some of our kids may only fit in the family circle, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. They may not want to be a part of the farm, and they may not be entitled to any of the farm if they've not helped build it. Some people may want to own part of the farm, but they may not want to be the one that's actually out there doing the work. Well, okay, they don't get a salary and wage from it, but they get return on their equity as their land value goes up in time and things like that. And maybe they get rents and lease payments and things from that. But again, we don't have to cram these three circles all over one another. We could talk all day about this. But you know what the hardest part of this is? The hardest part is mama and daddy figuring out how they want to do this and then getting on the same page. And I will tell you that it's hard sometimes because mom and dad may have different opinions on this. I remember Joe Kanan telling the story one time, one of my colleagues, about elderly man and wife was in his office and they just kept fighting and fighting and fighting over the situation and couldn't come to agreement. And finally she said, fine, do it your way. I'm going to outlive you anyway. And once you're gone, I'll just change it. That's when we're all supposed to laugh if we're all in a
That's
room
what my
together.
grandmother did.
She did, huh?
Yeah, my grandfather had wanted to leave the farm to the oldest boy so that that way there were no fights. There were, that was his succession plan. And she was very, very offended by that, but she didn't say anything. She waited till he passed and then she changed it where everybody gets a part of it.
One of the things that we do realize is most times we're not going to die at the same time. And so how we put this together and making this known becomes really, really important, because one of the things later I'm going to talk about anticipating disruptions, and a lot of times we think about disruptions as, divorce, disability, death, all of those type things. Well, the reality is we always worry about the younger generation getting a divorce or death, but the reality is often that maybe the greatest risk is when the older generation, after mom or dad dies, goes in and remarries. And you want to talk about some horror stories there. I can tell you about some real horror stories there. That's why it becomes really important that we set this plan in place and get it, if we want it to, where it can't be changed. Because, and again, I'm talking to mostly females on this audience, so I can say this. How many of your husbands, if you are the unfortunate one to go first, will stay single? If we are truly honest, men need someone to take care of them. That's just the reality. They need someone to take care of them. And so most male widows are remarried within about 365 days. That's 1 year. I've been told that the grieving process is about 2 weeks. Beyond that, he needs someone to cook for him and do his laundry. So, you just got to take that into consideration and think about all of that. But again, that compensation has to equal contribution, to me, becomes the overarching factor for how I put this together and how I make the decisions. But the most important thing is you do decide, you make the decisions. Now, how do I identify and develop those successors? Kind of like Ann talked about there, how do we pick that one that we want to take over, or that group? If I'm going to hire someone to take over my hardware store on rural Main Street, I'm going to look for someone that's got experience running a hardware store. I'm going to look to someone that maybe has been to business school. Why do we fail to treat farms as a business? Why do we think we don't need our successors to have training? We do. We do. We need them to go to college and learn things. We need them to work for someone else other than just us, to learn how other people do things. It becomes really important. Someone will ask how long is the succession planning process? I remember Dick Whitman saying in one of his classes, succession planning starts when you give your kids chores when they're 8 years old. When you give them chores and you give them responsibility, you are starting to train them how to take over. And this becomes really important, that you give them additional responsibility and that you don't hold everything all in yourself. Again, I'm not going to go through the actual process of succession planning too much. I wanted to talk more about the family side of it today. If we want to do this another day, we can talk more of the process. But we do think of succession planning as a 4-stage process: testing, commitment, establishment, and complete withdrawal. And, testing is where we just start working together more as they are part of the business. They're an employee working for us. And then once we start figuring out that this is going to work and we're going to work together, we give them more responsibility. They start having to put some skin in the game. One of my farmers that I've worked with tells a story about his dad. They were cattle feeders, and his dad, when he was a young man, sent him to the sale barn and said, I want you to go to the sale barn. I want you to buy your own pen of calves, and this is going to be your own pen. I'm not going to help you buy them. I want you to go buy your own pen. He said he went, and by the time he was done, he'd bought the awfulest set of calves, sick ones, this and that and everything. But you know what? He learned from that. He learned what not to do next time. We don't do a good job of giving our kids the chances to develop their skills. Unfortunately, we tell them what to do and we use them as grunt labor, and that's a problem. The third stage of succession planning is establishment. That's where I start turning the operation completely over to them, letting them take over while I'm there to mentor them, and then that slides into the withdrawal category. And when I say complete withdrawal, that scares your husbands, if they're the older generation, that scares them to death. Again, because their self-worth is tied up in that business. But think about it this way. if we were there together, we'd talk about what a mentor is. A mentor is someone that helps someone learn and is there to come alongside and help advise them, give them advice. Well, how much mentoring can you do from the casket? The reality is you can't. And often the older generation holds on to the checkbook and to the management. They use the kids for the slave labor, but they don't ever let them have any responsibility for management until the day after the funeral. You know, one of my colleagues tells a story about a guy that came to him, and he was in his mid 60s, and said, at what age should the older generation start letting the younger generation make management decisions? And she told him, she said, I know your son. He's in his 40s. He's very comparable. There's no reason why you can't start turning management over to him. Well, unfortunately, that wasn't what he was asking, because his 85-year-old father was still making every management decision for the farm. The 65-year-old was nearing the official retirement age, and he'd never been allowed to make a management decision in his life. And we laugh at that, but how often is that the way it works in farming? We just hold on to it with an iron fist, and we never think about moving over and letting the next generation take over. So, you think about it, you start as a grunt, and then maybe you get the idea to kind of work into the idea of an assistant manager. And then when mom or dad die, you get to become a CEO. That's the process, right? Well, maybe the idea of softening this blow of this idea of withdrawal is we think of moving out of the way of CEO and moving over into the idea of board chairman. What's the job of the board chairman? The board chairman's responsible for helping mentor the CEO, but they're not there for the day-to-day operations. They're not there day-to-day to make the decisions. This is sad. But when we were putting some of this curriculum together a few years ago, one of my colleagues told the story about one of the farmers that they knew that was so proud. He was bragging, so proud of his two sons. One, I think, was in his 30s and one was in his upper 20s, was going to be following in his dynasty. They were going to follow in his dynasty. Unfortunately, that farmer happened to have a heart attack and died from the heart attack. 30 days later, the eldest son committed suicide, and he left a suicide note, and he said, every day, my brother and I showed up to the farm. Dad told us what to do that day. I've never had to make a management decision in my entire life. I cannot handle the stress of it now, and afraid I'm going to let everyone down. So how good was that farmer's dynasty? Well, it stank. It really stank. He didn't have a dynasty. And again, that was not the younger generation's fault for why it wasn't successful. It was the older generation's fault because he refused to develop his successor. He used them as a grunt. He never developed them and mentored them to give them the skill set to take over. And that is such a tragic story, but one that we see all too often. I want to encourage you, again, this is something I stole from Dick Whitman, of Whitman Consulting. He flashed this picture and he said, think about the idea of giving everyone a job, a responsibility. And especially like Ann talked about where, this could have been a perfect scenario for her where there was multiple kids that wanted to be a part of the operation. Well, give someone the responsibility for the cattle operations. Give someone responsibility for the grain operations. And even under then, make someone the equipment maintenance manager. But set up your structure of how you want your business to run and give people responsibility. Do you know what happens when you give someone responsibility for something and you tell them you're responsible for whether it's successful or not? You have just immediately increased their motivation for wanting to do a good job. The problem with being a grunt is I get paid the same and I get the same results whether I work hard or not. Well, whenever you give someone responsibility for something, you have just motivated them tremendously to want to work hard and to want to do a good job. Think about how your farm structure should be laid out. How do we do this? As I said, we do it a little bit at a time. We turn over it. If you have not done any of this, then you need at least 5 years to put a good succession planning in place. The ones that are really, really hard is the call that I got, I believe it was in November, and said, Dad has just been diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. How soon can you get here? And I said, well, what do you have in place so far? Nothing. Those are the ones that become really, really difficult. But thankfully, they were trying to make some steps while Dad was still able to make those decisions. But we do this as a process. Now, I will tell you, you're going to have a clash of two systems. A family business is the hardest business there is to run, because the family, the attributes of a successful family are all about being loving, loyal, supportive, understanding, enduring. Whereas a business system that is successful is all about being goal-directed, profitable, effective, aggressive, innovative. You think a family is all about little change. A business is all about how can we exploit change. And so you're going to get this area of friction between this family circle over here on the left and the business circle over here on the right. And you're going to have this area of constant friction between the two. And it's going to be really important that we have that diagram kind of laid out to know who's responsible for what and who's responsible for making decisions. Because guess what? Are we partners, or are we dad and son? Or are we daughter and mom, or daughter and dad, or son-in-law, or whatever it is? We've got to remember that we are partners in this. We are not dad and son, because it's real easy to slide back into the dad and son role and do as I say. So we've got to remember that those systems are going to clash. We've got to make sure that we're communicating and working together. Again, a family-run business is the hardest type of business there is to run. Common barriers that we're going to run into on this: lack of planning. Again, this is a process that we want to have planned out. And I will tell you, a lot of people say, after they hear this presentation, will say, yeah, that's a good idea. Those are all good things. But you know what? I got planting to do today, or I got cattle to work, or something like that. And they don't ever get their butt in a seat and start laying some of this out. The other thing they start not doing a good job of is communication. Communication with those dreaded in-laws. Whether you have a son-in-law or a daughter-in-law, people a lot of times will say, well, they have no part in this. Well, who is the last person your son or daughter talks to at night before they're going to bed? I'm telling you, it's not you. So don't tell me that the in-laws don't have some say in this, because they do. They are a part of this. Whether they are an owner or not, they are a part of this. Lack of communication with the heirs that aren't there taking over the farm. They need to be communicated with. They need to be communicated with. And they also need to be given the chance to say, do they want to be involved or not? And a lot of people say, well, I know they're out in Texas now or New York. They don't want to have anything to do with the farm. Well, you know what? It will go a lot better for the son or daughter that is going to take over the farm if they are asked and given the chance to say no than if they are never asked. Again, we want to communicate with them and talk to them about this. And then we want to tell them, this is what I plan to do. This is it. And you know what? Your son or daughter may not like what you decide to do, but they're not going to hate you. Or I hope not. I hope they're not going to hate you. You are their parent. But if you leave it for them to fight over the day after the funeral, they absolutely will hate their brothers or sisters. And then communicating between spouses. Again, I said one of the hardest things here is for mom and dad to get on the same page and decide how they want to do this. And then again, communicating between the generations. I'm a really big believer, if we're going to farm together, if we're going to be in business together, we need regular business meetings. We need regular business meetings about the business, and we need regular family meetings that includes those non-business heirs, about how things are going. And that doesn't mean the afternoon of Thanksgiving dinner, pass the potatoes, what's in the will, or things like that. But we have to be communicating and having those regular, hopefully once a year meetings. This is a business expense. Send your kids a plane ticket and write it off as a farm expense. It's totally deductible. How we manage risk in this, again, we do this as a process. We turn it over gradually in place, but we do have a clear plan in place, because if we don't have a clear plan in place, it's going to be real hard for dad to let go. So that's why we have to address those power and control issues. We have to address them and remind them, Dad, I'm just as much an equal partner in this as you. You can't take all your stuff and your toys and go home and leave. We have to assure fair compensation. We have to protect those minority owners. And I mentioned earlier, anticipating disruptions. Again, divorce. What happens if my son or daughter gets divorced? But also, what happens if mom or dad get divorced? What happens to the farm then? What happens if mom or dad remarry after dad or mom passes away? And again, I can't stress enough this whole idea of communicating openly. The failures that I've seen in this, how this tends to fall apart, is again, failure to treat the farm as a business. One of my farmers one time said his dad was trying to do something, not in succession planning, but just in something different. He wanted to spend money on something. And he said, he told him, Dad, we can't do that. This isn't farming anymore. This is a business. And it seems kind of like a play on words, but it really is. It's like, no, we got to treat this as a business. We can't do that just because we want to. And then again, failure for the owner to retire. And that doesn't mean they get on their horse and they ride up into the mountains never to be seen again. That means failure to turn over that management authority to the next generation while you are still there able to act as a mentor. Again, how much mentorship can you do from the casket? None. And so those are the biggest failures I see, where the checkbook and all the management is turned over the day after the funeral, and the son or daughter just does not know how to do it. They've never been trained. And it's not their fault. They've just never been trained to make those decisions. They don't know how. And again, failure to develop an equitable estate plan in conjunction with your estate plan. Failure to figure out how I want to make those together. Again, I skipped through that whole point quickly about those tools in the toolbox, but why those are so important for me to take that estate plan and take it, that trust that that lady drew up, and draw it one step further to saying, this is how a son or daughter can buy out their brothers or sisters if one of them wants to sell. Why that is so important, because if I do not put that plan in place, do you know when that money is due? It is due the day after the funeral if that son or daughter wants it. And unfortunately, that puts a huge strain on the one that is trying to keep the farm going if they have to come up with an immediate boatload of cash, and they may not even be able to do it. They may not be able to come up with that amount of cash immediately. So that's why it's so important for you to put a plan in place that if one of you wants to sell out, this is the process by which it's going to happen. This is the terms by which it's going to happen. Like it or lump it, you don't get a say in it. I'm the one who owns the gold, and I'm making the rules. And I will say this is not a very popular statement probably, but I do believe we have one responsibility to our kids, and that is to help train them to be responsible adults. Beyond that, it's your gold, and you can do whatever you want to with it. You have no obligation to give it to any one or multiples of them. Do with it what you want to do. Put the plan in place. Last failure to provide adequate compensation just causes problems further down the road. Again, this slide right here that John Baker showed down in Memphis at the Women in Ag conference I was at has probably changed my career more than anything else I've seen. Just the idea of I was doing a good job training families how to do estate planning. I talked about trust. I talked about beneficiary deeds, non-probate transfers, all that stuff. And when I had a chance to go through the International Farm Transition Network training a few years ago to become a certified succession planning coordinator, I thought we were going to talk about all that stuff. And you know what we spent 3 days talking about? We spent 3 days talking about people skills and how to get families working together and how to help families make decisions when they don't always agree. It was all the people side of stuff, because that's where the succession planning is so critical. It's so critical. So I hope I've kind of maybe encouraged you to think about this process and go through it and work on it. As I said, I didn't go a lot about the actual process, like SWOT analysis and business planning, all that. I wanted to talk about the people side of it, because that's where I think the real mistakes get made. We don't work with one another and plan out the process. We've got 5 or 10 minutes for questions. Does anyone have any questions?
This is not personally me, but I do know someone who their biggest challenge, they need to approach their parents on getting a succession and an estate plan together. And that's probably more of the people skills side of that, because they don't want to make their parents feel like they're pushing them or they're thinking about that, or that their parents need to go with what they want, but they just want their parents to think about that. How's a way you can approach that, Wesley?
Yeah, and that's difficult. And that's a question that I get asked all the time. And one of these days, maybe a light bulb will come on and I'll get the perfect answer. But unfortunately, I've yet to come up with it. You don't, again, as I say, after Thanksgiving dinner, say what's in the will. But I guess you just try opening up those lines of communication and saying, what do you want to have happen after you're gone? You try to get them to a program where I can hit them over the head with the stick and say, hey, if you don't do this, more times than not, it's not going to be successful after you're gone. That's why I hit them right up pretty blunt face on it. But, for you as a family member to start opening those lines of communication, I don't have the good answer, and I'm sorry. I just don't. I don't have the good answer. One of these days I'll come up with one. You've got to approach it in a way that you don't challenge their self-worth of, what are you telling me? You telling me I've got to quit? You telling me I got to get out of the way? You don't approach it in a way where they feel like, oh, you just want the money. You're just wanting the money. But I think you approach it from the standpoint of what we just said, that we want to see this successful after you're gone, whatever your wishes are. Let's take some time and talk about this and figure out how to give us all the best chances of survival. And I don't know, as I said, one of these days I'll figure out the correct way to do that, but I haven't figured it out yet. Well, again, there's my phone number and email if I can help you in any way. I think we're going to be rolling out some more resources on this. My plan is to kind of create an online portal at MU where we can actually create a succession planning thrust and maybe get some coaches out there and some stuff that we can help some families. It's a messy process. My daughter just turned 12 the other day, and you know what I tell my daughter as she goes to middle school? I tell her every day, people are messy. People are messy, and one day your friend is going to be your best friend, and the next day she's going to stab you in the back. People are messy, and I will tell you, families are messy. That's why we have to try to step away from thinking of this just as a family and think about it as a business of, what do I want to see happen to my business after I'm gone? Again, the easiest thing to do is to just go up and draw up a trust or some type of deal and leave it to all of the kids where they have to work together. Now, I'll be honest with you, and you're going to get my opinion here. I am not a fan of those that said, we're just going to leave it to all four of them because we don't want to see it split. I'm going to leave it to all four of them together, and they'll just have to agree and work together. Well, that is probably the greatest chance for that it will leave the family, because how many does it take to petition the judge for a partition suit? It only takes one. So the idea of leaving it to all of them, leaving all 1,000 acres to all four of them together and saying they're just going to have to get along, that's probably a recipe for that the farm's going to end up getting sold and out of the family, and no one's going to get it. Think very strategically about how you want to do that. Any other questions? If not, well, I appreciate you guys joining us, and we'll go ahead and say goodbye. Have a good weekend, everybody.